Question: which emperor terrified Rome more, the madman on the throne or the scholar beneath it? Caligula's gone. The parties start, and then the doors below the palace click shut. Charts, instruments, people reduced to data. If cruelty had a lab coat, it would be his. Tonight, the experiments Rome tried to erase, Claudius unmasked. Before diving into this forgotten tale of imperial depravity, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark chapters together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the shadows that lurk behind civilization's greatest achievements. Most people know Claudius as the stammering, limping emperor who conquered Britain and built aqueducts. The scholarly ruler who seemed almost benign compared to his predecessor's legendary cruelties. But that version of Claudius is a carefully constructed lie, a myth created by historians who couldn't bear to record the full scope of what actually happened during those 13 years when Rome trembled under his rule. The real Claudius was something far worse than Caligula ever imagined being. Where Caligula's madness was theatrical and obvious, Claudius's darkness was methodical, calculated, and hidden behind a facade of intellectual respectability that fooled generations of scholars who preferred their monsters to be obviously monstrous. The truth about Claudius begins not with his public coronation, but with what happened in the hours immediately following Caligula's death. While senators debated the restoration of the Republic and citizens celebrated in the streets, Claudius was busy in the palace's deepest chambers, conducting experiments that would have horrified even the most jaded Roman physician. You see, Claudius had spent years observing his nephew's cruelties, not with disgust, but with the clinical interest of a natural philosopher studying an interesting specimen. He took notes, detailed notes, and when the opportunity arose to surpass his predecessor's achievements, he was ready. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came during Claudius's coronation feast. Traditional Roman banquets were elaborate affairs, but this celebration included dishes that made even hardened legionnaires reach for their wine cups with trembling hands. The emperor had commissioned his personal chef, a Greek named Locusta, who would later become infamous for her expertise with poisons, to prepare delicacies that pushed the boundaries of what civilized people considered edible. Ancient sources carefully coded in language that modern scholars have only recently begun to decipher describe preparations that involved ingredients no kitchen should ever contain. But the feast was merely an introduction to appetites that extended far beyond food. Within weeks of taking power, Claudius had established what he called his research chambers beneath the palace. Officially, these were described as medical facilities where the emperor pursued his scholarly interests in anatomy and natural philosophy. The reality was something that would haunt the nightmares of anyone who witnessed it. Slaves disappeared into those chambers in a steady stream, selected not for punishment or execution but for characteristics that served the emperor's particular interests. Young, healthy specimens who possessed qualities that Claudius found intellectually stimulating. The emperor's personal physician, a man named Xenophon, who left behind encrypted journals that weren't decoded until the 20th century, documented procedures that were presented as medical research but served purposes that had nothing to do with healing. Claudius wasn't content to simply kill his victims. He wanted to understand them, to explore the limits of human endurance, to map the precise boundaries between life and death. His chambers contained instruments that had been specially crafted by the finest artisans in the empire, tools designed for explorations that pushed the human form into territories it was never meant to inhabit. What made Claudius particularly dangerous was his intelligence. Unlike Caligula, who acted on impulse and emotion, Claudius approached his darker pursuits with the methodical precision of a scholar. He kept detailed records, conducted controlled experiments, and developed theories about human nature that he tested with the thoroughness of a natural philosopher, investigating the properties of metals or the behavior of celestial bodies. His victims weren't just objects of cruelty, they were research subjects in investigations that revealed truths about the human condition that civilized society preferred not to acknowledge. The emperor's interests weren't limited to physical experimentation. He developed what he called social anatomies, complex scenarios where he would place individuals in carefully constructed situations designed to reveal their deepest fears, desires, and breaking points. Wealthy citizens would receive invitations to what they believed were exclusive dinner parties, only to discover they were participants in elaborate psychological experiments. Families were separated and subjected to choices designed to test the limits of parental love, spousal loyalty, and sibling bonds. Claudius would observe these proceedings from hidden alcoves, taking notes on human behavior under extreme duress. The palace staff who served during this period left behind testimonies that paint a picture of an imperial household that functioned more like a laboratory than a residence. Servants were assigned specific roles in maintaining the emperor's research facilities. Some tended to the subjects in the holding areas, ensuring they remained healthy enough for experimentation. Others cleaned and maintained the specialized equipment. Still others were responsible for disposing of the remains once Claudius had completed his investigations. These staff members were sworn to absolute secrecy under penalty of becoming research subjects themselves, a threat that proved remarkably effective at maintaining silence. What's particularly disturbing is how Claudius integrated his private pursuits with his public duties as emperor. He would conduct business meetings while observing experiments through specially designed viewing ports. Important decisions about military campaigns, provincial governance, and legal matters were made while the emperor watched human beings subjected to procedures that defied description. This wasn't compartmentalized behavior where public virtue existed separately from private vice. For Claudius, the exercise of absolute power and the exploration of human limits were fundamentally connected activities. The emperor's appetite for experimentation extended beyond individual subjects to entire populations. When rebellions erupted in distant provinces, Claudius saw opportunities for large-scale research. Military commanders received orders that seemed strategically sound, but were actually designed to create specific conditions that would allow the emperor to study human behavior during extreme crisis. Entire cities were subjected to sieges that lasted precisely calculated lengths of time. Populations were deliberately driven to starvation levels that Claudius had determined through previous experiments. The conquest of Britain, celebrated as a great imperial achievement, was actually a massive field study in the psychology of conquest and subjugation. Roman historians writing during Claudius's reign and immediately afterward faced an impossible dilemma. They couldn't ignore the emperor's achievements, his public works projects, his legal reforms, his successful military campaigns, but they also couldn't record the true nature of his private pursuits without risking their own lives and the lives of their families. So they developed a coded language, a way of hinting at dark truths without stating them explicitly. Modern scholars who have learned to read these codes have discovered that nearly every positive account of Claudius's reign contains subtle references to horrors that contemporary writers couldn't safely describe directly. The emperor's influence extended beyond the palace walls through a network of individuals who shared his interests. Wealthy Romans discovered that demonstrating similar appetites was a pathway to imperial favor. Provincial governors learned that reports of interesting local customs, particularly those involving human suffering, would earn them commendation from the emperor. A shadow culture developed throughout the empire, a community of individuals who found in Claudius's reign permission to explore their own darkest impulses under the guise of natural philosophy and imperial service. What made this network particularly dangerous was its intellectual sophistication. These weren't crude sadists acting on base impulses. They were educated individuals who had convinced themselves that their activities served higher purposes. They developed philosophical frameworks that justified their behavior, created elaborate theories about human nature that required practical investigation, and established schools of thought that attracted followers throughout the empire. Claudius had given them not just permission, but intellectual respectability for pursuits that previous ages would have recognized as simple evil. The emperor's personal relationships reflected these same disturbing patterns. His wives, his children, his closest advisors were all subjects of his ongoing research into human psychology. He would create situations designed to test their loyalty, their capacity for deception, their breaking points under pressure. Family dinners became exercises in psychological manipulation. Private conversations were experiments in emotional control. Even his most intimate relationships were laboratory conditions designed to reveal truths about power, fear, and human nature. This systematic approach to cruelty had effects that extended far beyond the immediate victims. Roman society during Claudius's reign developed a kind of collective trauma, a shared understanding that safety was an illusion, and that the emperor's attention, whether positive or negative, was something to be feared above all else. Citizens learned to watch their words, to guard their expressions, to avoid displaying characteristics that might attract imperial interest. The vibrant political and cultural life that had flourished under previous emperors withered as creative individuals recognized that innovation and excellence were dangerous qualities that might draw the wrong kind of attention. The emperor's legacy wasn't limited to his own lifetime. The systems he established, the networks he created, the philosophical frameworks he developed continued to operate long after his death. Successive emperors inherited not just the throne, but the infrastructure of systematic cruelty that Claudius had woven into the fabric of imperial administration. Some tried to dismantle these systems, but discovered that they had become so integrated into the functioning of government that removing them threatened the stability of the empire itself. As we stand in that marble corridor where our journey began, watching those terrified senators hurry past, we begin to understand that their fear wasn't just about political uncertainty. They sensed something that history would spend centuries trying to forget, that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who convince us they're scholars, that the greatest horrors emerge not from obvious madness, but from intelligence turned toward inhuman purposes. The coded testimonies left by palace servants paint an even darker picture of daily life under Claudius's rule. These weren't random acts of violence or momentary lapses in judgment. They were carefully orchestrated investigations into what the emperor called the architecture of human will. Claudius had become obsessed with understanding exactly how much pressure was required to reshape a person's fundamental nature, to transform their core beliefs and loyalties through applied suffering. His methodology was terrifyingly sophisticated. The emperor would select subjects from across the social spectrum, from slave children to senators' wives, studying how different backgrounds and experiences affected their responses to his treatments. He maintained detailed charts tracking the progression of each experiment, noting which techniques proved most effective at breaking down specific types of resistance. These records, written in his own hand using a cipher that took archaeologists decades to crack, reveal a mind that approached human suffering with the same systematic precision that other scholars brought to mathematics or astronomy. The palace workshops hummed day and night, producing specialized equipment designed to the emperor's exact specifications. Master craftsmen, sworn to secrecy and terrified of refusal, created devices that pushed the boundaries of Roman engineering in service of Claudius's research. These weren't crude torture implements, but precision instruments calibrated to produce specific physiological and psychological effects. The emperor's personal blacksmith, a man whose encrypted journal was discovered hidden behind a false wall in 1847, described creating mechanisms so intricate and purposeful that their very existence challenged his understanding of what civilized people were capable of conceiving. What distinguished Claudius from his predecessor wasn't just the scale of his cruelties, but their intellectual framework. Caligula had been driven by madness, by impulses he couldn't control or fully understand. Claudius was driven by curiosity, by a scholar's need to comprehend the fundamental nature of human existence through direct observation and experimentation. He genuinely believed he was advancing human knowledge, pushing the boundaries of natural philosophy into territories that squeamish predecessors had been too weak to explore. The emperor established what he called observation protocols, systematic procedures for documenting human responses to extreme conditions. Teams of scribes worked in shifts, recording every detail of his experiments. They noted physical reactions, emotional responses, the precise moment when subjects abandoned hope, the exact words spoken during various stages of breakdown. These records were compiled into volumes that Claudius studied obsessively, searching for patterns that might reveal universal truths about human nature. His research extended beyond individual psychology to encompass what we might now recognize as early social engineering. Claudius would orchestrate complex scenarios involving multiple subjects, studying how group dynamics evolved under pressure. He created artificial communities within his research facilities, complete with hierarchies, economies, and social structures, then systematically introduced stressors designed to reveal how civilized behavior collapsed under specific conditions. These experiments could last for months, with the emperor observing through hidden passages as his artificial societies devolved, according to principles he was determined to understand and catalog. The most disturbing aspect of Claudius's reign wasn't the suffering he inflicted, but the intellectual community he created around that suffering. The emperor attracted followers throughout the empire, educated individuals who shared his belief that true wisdom required direct investigation of humanity's darkest potentials. They corresponded regularly, sharing findings from their own research, debating methodologies, refining techniques. Provincial governors would send detailed reports about local customs involving human sacrifice or extreme punishment, framing their observations in the language of natural philosophy that Claudius had made fashionable. This network of like-minded researchers established schools throughout the empire, institutions that appeared to focus on traditional subjects like rhetoric and mathematics, but actually served as training grounds for the emperor's expanding program of human investigation. Students learned to observe human behavior with clinical detachment, to design experiments that would reveal hidden psychological truths, to document their findings with the precision that Claudius demanded. Graduation from these programs guaranteed positions in the imperial administration, creating a bureaucracy staffed by individuals who viewed human suffering as raw material for intellectual advancement. The emperor's influence on Roman law reflected these same disturbing priorities. Claudius revised legal codes to create new categories of punishment that seemed designed more for research purposes than justice. Traditional Roman law had recognized clear distinctions between different types of crimes and their appropriate penalties. Under Claudius, those distinctions blurred as legal proceedings became opportunities to study human behavior under judicial pressure. Trials were extended far beyond what justice required, with defendants subjected to procedures that seemed calculated to produce specific psychological states rather than determine guilt or innocence. The emperor's personal involvement in these legal experiments was extensive and hands-on. He would preside over trials personally, not to ensure justice, but to observe how different types of pressure affected testimony and behavior. Witnesses were subjected to interrogation techniques that Claudius had developed through his private research, methods designed to strip away social facades and reveal what he believed were more fundamental truths about human nature. The emperor took detailed notes during these proceedings, treating Roman law as another laboratory for his ongoing investigations. Religious practices under Claudius underwent similar transformations, as the emperor saw traditional ceremonies as opportunities for large-scale behavioral research. He introduced new festivals and rituals that appeared to honor the gods, but actually served as controlled environments for studying crowd psychology and religious fervor. These events could last for days, with participants subjected to escalating physical and emotional demands, designed to produce the kind of extreme states that Claudius found intellectually stimulating. Priests who served during these ceremonies reported experiences that haunted them for years afterward, visions of human nature stripped of all pretense and dignity. The emperor's approach to military campaigns reflected these same research priorities. Roman armies under Claudius received orders that seemed strategically sound, but were actually designed to create specific battlefield conditions that would allow for systematic study of human behavior under extreme stress. Officers were instructed to document their soldiers' responses to hunger, exhaustion, fear, and violence with a precision that went far beyond military necessity. Enemy populations weren't just conquered, they were subjected to carefully calibrated pressures designed to test theories about cultural resilience and social collapse. What made these military experiments particularly effective was their integration with legitimate strategic objectives. The conquest of Britain wasn't just a successful expansion of Roman power, It was a massive field study in the psychology of resistance and submission. Claudius had theorized that different populations would respond to conquest in predictable ways based on their cultural backgrounds and social structures. The British campaign provided an opportunity to test these theories on an unprecedented scale, with entire tribes serving as experimental subjects in investigations that revealed patterns the emperor believed were universal to human societies. The documentation from these campaigns, preserved in military archives that weren't open to scholars until the late 19th century, reveals the systematic nature of Claudius's research methodology. Roman commanders were required to submit detailed reports not just about tactical developments, but about the psychological states of both their own troops and enemy populations. They documented how different types of pressure affected morale, resistance, and social cohesion. They recorded the precise conditions under which civilized behavior broke down and more primitive responses emerged. These military experiments provided Claudius with data that informed his domestic policies and private research. Techniques developed on foreign battlefields were refined and applied within the empire itself, as the emperor sought to understand whether the principles governing human behavior in war applied equally to peacetime situations. Provincial administrators received instructions to implement policies that appeared focused on efficient governance, but actually served as controlled experiments in social control and population management. The emperor's fascination with human limits extended to his own family and closest associates, who found themselves unwitting subjects in his ongoing research. Claudius would create elaborate scenarios designed to test their loyalty, their capacity for deception, their emotional breaking points. Family gatherings became exercises in psychological manipulation, with the emperor observing how his relatives responded to carefully orchestrated stresses. His wives discovered that their most private conversations were being documented and analyzed, their emotional responses cataloged as data points in investigations they never consented to join. This systematic betrayal of intimate relationships created an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that permeated the highest levels of Roman society. Nobody could be certain which conversations were genuine and which were experimented, which gestures of affection were sincere, and which were designed to produce specific reactions for the emperor's research. The corrosive effects of this uncertainty extended far beyond the palace walls, as citizens throughout the empire learned to guard their words and expressions, understanding that any display of genuine emotion might attract the attention of investigators who viewed human feeling as raw material for scholarly inquiry. The tools and techniques developed during Claudius's reign didn't disappear with his death. They became part of the imperial toolkit, refined and expanded by successors who may not have shared his intellectual curiosity, but recognized the practical value of his methods for maintaining control over vast populations. The systematic study of human breaking points, the careful documentation of psychological vulnerabilities, the integration of research and governance, these innovations became permanent features of Roman administration that influenced imperial policy for centuries to come. As the years passed and the initial shock of Caligula's assassination faded, Roman citizens began to understand that they had exchanged one kind of monster for another. The theatrical madness of the previous emperor had been replaced by something far more dangerous, a calculated cruelty that hid behind masks of scholarly respectability and intellectual achievement. The marble corridors of the palace that had once echoed with Caligula's ranting now hummed with the quiet efficiency of systematic investigation, the measured voices of researchers documenting human suffering with clinical precision. The transformation of Roman society under Claudius's rule wasn't immediately apparent to the average citizen. Unlike Caligula's theatrical displays of madness that had terrorized the streets, Claudius's horrors were methodically hidden behind the facade of scholarly pursuit and administrative efficiency. Citizens initially welcomed the change from chaos to apparent order, not understanding that they had simply traded visible brutality for something far more insidious and systematic. The emperor's network of researchers and collaborators expanded throughout the provinces with remarkable speed and organization. Regional administrators discovered that advancement in the imperial hierarchy required demonstrating not just competence in traditional governance, but also a willingness to participate in what Claudius termed applied human studies. Governors who submitted detailed reports about local customs, social structures, and population vulnerabilities found themselves rewarded with prestigious assignments and increased authority. Those who showed squeamishness about the emperor's research priorities discovered their careers stagnating in remote outposts far from imperial attention. Provincial centers became laboratories where Claudius's theories about human nature were tested on increasingly large scales. The emperor had developed complex hypotheses about how different populations would respond to specific types of pressure, and he viewed the vast diversity of the Roman Empire as an unprecedented opportunity for controlled experimentation. Celtic tribes in Gaul were subjected to administrative policies designed to test their cultural resilience. Greek cities found their traditional autonomies gradually eroded through measures that appeared to be routine imperial standardization, but were actually calculated to produce predictable psychological responses. The documentation requirements for these provincial experiments were extraordinarily detailed. Local administrators were required to maintain records that went far beyond typical governmental bookkeeping. They documented population movements, social tensions, religious observances, and cultural practices with a precision that served no obvious administrative purpose. These records were compiled and forwarded to Rome, where teams of analysts working directly under Claudius's supervision searched for patterns that might reveal universal principles governing human behavior under imperial rule. What made these large-scale experiments particularly effective was their integration with legitimate imperial policy. Citizens experiencing increased taxation, modified legal procedures, or altered religious regulations had no way of knowing that these changes were actually components of carefully designed research protocols. The suffering they experienced felt random and bureaucratic, the inevitable friction of living under imperial rule. They couldn't perceive the systematic nature of their treatment or understand that their responses were being cataloged as data points in investigations that reduced their humanity to observable phenomena. The emperor's research methodology extended beyond direct observation to encompass what we might now recognize as early forms of social manipulation and control. Claudius had theorized that human behavior could be shaped and directed through the careful application of rewards and punishments, but not in the crude manner of simple conditioning. He believed that truly effective control required understanding the deeper psychological mechanisms that governed individual and group decision-making. His experiments were designed to map these mechanisms with scientific precision, creating tools that future rulers could use to manage populations with unprecedented efficiency. Religious institutions throughout the empire became unwitting participants in these investigations. Claudius introduced new ceremonial requirements that appeared to strengthen traditional Roman religious observance, but actually served as opportunities for studying crowd psychology and religious fervor. Festivals were extended and intensified, with participants subjected to physical and emotional demands that pushed them toward the extreme states that the emperor found most instructive. Priests reported that these enhanced ceremonies produced profound spiritual experiences, not understanding that the transcendent moments they witnessed were actually carefully orchestrated psychological breakdowns designed to reveal fundamental truths about human nature. The emperor's personal involvement in religious experimentation went far beyond policy directives. He would travel throughout the empire incognito, attending local festivals and ceremonies to observe firsthand how different populations responded to religious pressure. These journeys, officially described as inspection tours of provincial administration, were actually field research expeditions where Claudius could gather data about human behavior in natural settings. Local officials would receive advance instructions to implement temporary modifications to traditional ceremonies, changes that appeared to be minor adjustments but were actually components of controlled experiments in mass psychology. Military units under Claudius faced training regimens that seemed designed to build exceptional discipline and effectiveness, but actually served as ongoing experiments in human endurance and group dynamics. Soldiers were subjected to exercises that pushed far beyond what military necessity required, with officers instructed to document precisely how different types of stress affected unit cohesion, individual performance, and loyalty to command. These training protocols were refined based on data collected from previous experiments, creating military forces that were simultaneously more effective in battle and more thoroughly understood as psychological entities. The emperor's approach to military logistics reflected these same research priorities. Supply chains were deliberately stressed to create controlled shortages that would allow for systematic study of how privation affected military performance. Soldiers would find themselves facing calculated hardships that seemed like the inevitable challenges of campaign life, but were actually precisely calibrated conditions designed to produce specific behavioral responses. Officers documented how hunger, exhaustion, and fear affected decision making, leadership effectiveness, and troop morale, creating detailed databases of information about human behavior under extreme conditions. These military experiments provided Claudius with insights that informed his broader theories about human nature and social control. Techniques that proved effective at managing soldier behavior were adapted for civilian populations, as the emperor recognized that the fundamental psychological mechanisms governing human responses remained constant across different social contexts. The empire became a vast laboratory where methods developed in military settings were tested and refined for broader application, creating systems of control that were simultaneously more subtle and more comprehensive than anything previous rulers had achieved. The integration of research and governance extended to the most basic levels of Roman administration. Tax collectors were trained not just to extract revenue efficiently, but to observe and document how different populations responded to financial pressure. Census takers gathered information that went far beyond demographic data, recording details about family structures, social relationships, and community dynamics that served no obvious administrative purpose, but proved invaluable for the emperor's ongoing investigations into human behavior. Local magistrates throughout the empire received training in observation techniques that transformed routine legal proceedings into opportunities for psychological research. Court cases were extended and complicated through procedures that appeared to serve legal purposes, but actually created controlled environments for studying human responses to judicial pressure. Defendants, witnesses, and even spectators found themselves subjected to interrogation methods that Claudius had developed through his private research. Techniques designed to strip away social facades and reveal what the emperor believed were more fundamental truths about human motivation and character. The systematic nature of these judicial experiments meant that Roman law itself began to evolve in directions that served research purposes rather than traditional concepts of justice. Legal precedents accumulated that reflected not principled jurisprudence but the results of ongoing investigations into human psychology under stress. Citizens appearing before imperial courts faced proceedings that seemed to follow established legal forms, but were actually components of elaborate experiments designed to test theories about guilt, innocence, and the malleability of human conscience under pressure. Educational institutions throughout the empire underwent similar transformations, as Claudius recognized their potential as sources of research subjects and training grounds for future investigators. Schools that appeared to focus on traditional Roman curricula actually served as laboratories where young minds could be studied and shaped according to principles the emperor was developing through his broader research program. Students were subjected to educational experiences that seemed designed to build character and knowledge, but actually served to test theories about human development, learning, and the formation of social loyalties. The teaching methods employed in these schools reflected Claudius's systematic approach to understanding human psychology. Lessons were structured to create specific types of stress and challenge, with instructors trained to observe and document how students responded to different pedagogical pressures. Educational assessments became opportunities for psychological evaluation, as teachers gathered data about individual personalities, intellectual capabilities, and emotional vulnerabilities that served no obvious academic purpose, but proved valuable for the emperor's ongoing investigations. Teachers throughout the empire found themselves functioning as unwitting research assistants in investigations they didn't fully understand. They received detailed instructions about classroom management techniques that appeared to be sound educational practice but were actually components of controlled experiments in child psychology and social development. The information they gathered was compiled and forwarded to imperial administrators who used it to refine theories about human nature and develop more effective methods of social control. The long-term effects of these educational experiments extended far beyond the immediate subjects involved. Entire generations of Roman citizens grew up under educational systems that had been designed not just to transmit knowledge and cultural values, but to study and shape human development according to principles that Claudius had developed through his research. These citizens carried the psychological imprints of their educational experiences throughout their lives, creating a population that had been subtly conditioned to respond to authority and social pressure in ways that served imperial control objectives. Commercial activities throughout the empire became additional venues for the emperor's investigations into human behavior. Merchants discovered that trading privileges and market access were increasingly tied to their willingness to gather and report information about customer behavior, regional economic patterns, and social dynamics in commercial settings. What appeared to be routine business intelligence actually served as data collection for the emperor's ongoing studies of human motivation, decision-making, and social interaction under market pressures. The systematic integration of research objectives into commercial regulation created an economic environment where business success required participation in the emperor's investigative agenda. Merchants who demonstrated skill at observing and documenting human behavior found themselves rewarded with favorable trading terms and market opportunities. Those who showed reluctance to participate in these information-gathering activities discovered their commercial prospects declining as imperial favor shifted toward more cooperative competitors. Banking and financial institutions became particularly valuable sources of data about human psychology under economic pressure. The emperor's agents embedded within these institutions gathered detailed information about how different types of financial stress affected individual and family behavior. Loan applications, debt negotiations, and bankruptcy proceedings became opportunities for psychological research as financial professionals documented the progression of human responses to economic desperation. This integration of financial intelligence with psychological research provided Claudius with insights that informed imperial economic policy and broader theories about human nature. The emperor understood that economic pressure could be used as a tool for social control, but only if applied with scientific precision, based on accurate understanding of how different populations responded to financial stress. The banking data his agents collected allowed for the development of economic policies that appeared to serve traditional fiscal objectives, but actually functioned as large-scale experiments in population management and behavioral modification. The cumulative effect of these interconnected research programs was the transformation of Roman society into something unprecedented in human history. Citizens lived their entire lives within systems that appeared to function according to traditional social, political, and economic principles, but were actually components of a vast experimental apparatus designed to study and control human behavior with scientific precision. They experienced their daily interactions with imperial authority as routine governance, not understanding that every aspect of their existence was being observed, documented, and analyzed as data and investigations that reduced their humanity to observable phenomena. The psychological impact of living within such a system was profound and lasting, even for citizens who never directly encountered the emperor's research facilities or became conscious subjects in his experiments. The knowledge that imperial authority possessed unprecedented insight into human psychology and social dynamics created an atmosphere of uncertainty and self-consciousness that affected even the most private aspects of daily life. Citizens learned to monitor their own behavior, understanding that any display of unusual characteristics or social deviation might attract unwanted attention from investigators who viewed human difference as material for scholarly inquiry. The transformation of Roman society under Claudius reached its most insidious form through what the emperor termed his domestic observation protocols. Unlike the grand experiments conducted in military campaigns or provincial administrations, these investigations targeted the most intimate spaces of Roman life, the family unit itself. Claudius had theorized that true understanding of human nature required observation of behavior in its most unguarded state, when individuals believed themselves free from external scrutiny and social performance. Imperial agents carefully selected and trained in the emperor's methodology were embedded within households throughout the empire. These weren't crude spies gathering political intelligence, but sophisticated observers trained to document the subtle dynamics of family relationships, the progression of domestic conflicts, and the psychological mechanisms that governed intimate human connections. They posed as tutors, physicians, household managers, and trusted servants, positions that granted them access to private conversations and unguarded moments while maintaining perfect cover for their true purposes. The selection criteria for these domestic agents revealed the sophisticated nature of Claudius's research program. Candidates underwent extensive psychological evaluation to identify individuals capable of maintaining emotional detachment while observing human suffering and betrayal. They received training and memory techniques that allowed them to record detailed observations without maintaining written records that might be discovered. Most importantly, they were conditioned to view the families they infiltrated as research subjects rather than human beings, a psychological framework that enabled them to document intimate betrayals and emotional devastation with clinical objectivity. The intelligence gathered through these domestic infiltrations provided Claudius with unprecedented insights into the private lives of Roman citizens. Agents submitted regular reports documenting marital tensions, parent-child relationships, sibling rivalries, and the countless small cruelties that characterized family life under imperial pressure. These observations were compiled into detailed psychological profiles that revealed patterns of behavior, emotional vulnerabilities, and social dependencies that could be exploited for broader control purposes. What made these domestic experiments particularly effective was their integration with seemingly benevolent imperial policies. Families experiencing financial difficulties would receive assistance from imperial welfare programs, not understanding that their benefactors were actually researchers interested in studying how economic relief affected family dynamics and social loyalty. Children selected for educational opportunities in Rome discovered that their advancement came with requirements to report on their families' private conversations and emotional states, transforming filial relationships into tools of imperial surveillance. The emperor's fascination with family psychology led to the development of what he called generational studies, long-term investigations that tracked multiple generations of specific families to understand how psychological traits, social behaviors, and political loyalties were transmitted across time. These studies required maintaining surveillance networks within target families for decades, with agents passing their assignments to carefully selected successors who could continue observations seamlessly across generational transitions. The documentation from these generational studies, preserved in encrypted archives that weren't decoded until modern archaeological techniques became available, reveals the extraordinary scope and duration of Claudius's research program. Individual families were tracked for up to 60 years with detailed records maintained about marriage patterns, child-rearing practices, economic decisions, and political affiliations. The data collected allowed imperial administrators to predict and manipulate family behavior with unprecedented precision, creating tools for social control that operated at the most fundamental levels of human organization. Religious observance within these monitored households became another vector for psychological investigation. Agents documented how families adapted traditional Roman religious practices to accommodate imperial requirements, noting the tensions between private belief and public compliance. They observed the psychological mechanisms that allowed individuals to maintain personal faith while participating in state-sponsored ceremonies that contradicted their private convictions, gathering data about cognitive dissonance and religious adaptation that informed broader theories about population control through spiritual manipulation. The emperor's interest in domestic psychology extended to the most intimate aspects of marital relationships. Agents received specific training in observing and documenting sexual behavior, emotional intimacy, and the private negotiations that characterized Roman marriages. This information served multiple research purposes, providing insights into gender dynamics, power relationships, and the psychological foundations of social stability that Claudius believed were essential for effective imperial governance. These investigations into marital intimacy revealed patterns that challenged conventional understanding of Roman family structures. The emperor discovered that many apparently stable marriages were actually elaborate performances, maintained for social and economic reasons, with spouses leading parallel emotional lives that rarely intersected. This knowledge allowed imperial administrators to identify and exploit marital vulnerabilities, using intimate intelligence to manipulate political behavior and ensure loyalty to imperial authority. The psychological pressure of living under such intensive surveillance created secondary effects that Claudius found equally fascinating. Families began to modify their behavior in response to suspected observation, creating artificial domestic environments designed to present favorable impressions to imagined watchers. The emperor's agents documented these adaptive behaviors, studying how awareness of surveillance changed family dynamics and individual psychological development. Children growing up in households under investigation developed distinctive psychological profiles that reflected their adaptation to environments where privacy was an illusion and authentic emotional expression carried risks. These children learned to compartmentalize their thoughts and feelings, creating internal barriers between their genuine selves and the personas they presented to potential observers. The long-term effects of this psychological conditioning created adults who were simultaneously more compliant to authority and more psychologically fragmented than previous generations of Roman citizens. The educational implications of domestic surveillance extended beyond individual psychological development to encompass broader questions about social reproduction and cultural transmission. Claudius theorized that controlling family environments would allow imperial authority to shape the development of future generations, creating populations that were psychologically predisposed to accept and support imperial rule. The domestic surveillance network became a tool for social engineering on an unprecedented scale, attempting to modify human nature itself through controlled manipulation of developmental environments. Marriage arrangements throughout the empire began to reflect the emperor's research priorities, as much as traditional considerations of wealth, status, and political alliance. Imperial agents identified individuals whose psychological profiles suggested they would produce offspring with desirable characteristics, then worked to facilitate marriages that would serve the emperor's long-term breeding objectives. These interventions were subtle and indirect, appearing to result from natural social processes rather than deliberate manipulation, but they represented systematic attempts to engineer human genetic and psychological development according to imperial specifications. The economic dimensions of domestic surveillance created additional layers of control and manipulation. Families under investigation found their financial circumstances mysteriously improving or deteriorating in ways that served the emperor's research objectives. Those whose behavior patterns proved particularly instructive received economic incentives that encouraged them to continue displaying the characteristics that made them valuable research subjects. Others experienced financial pressures designed to test their psychological resilience and document their adaptive responses. Commercial relationships became vectors for domestic intelligence as merchants, craftsmen, and service providers were recruited to observe and report on their customers' private lives. These commercial agents received training in psychological observation techniques and were rewarded for gathering information about family dynamics, personal relationships, and individual behavioral patterns. The integration of domestic surveillance with commercial activity created an intelligence network that penetrated every aspect of daily life, making privacy impossible and authentic human connection increasingly dangerous. The medical establishment throughout the empire became another component of the domestic surveillance apparatus. Physicians were trained to gather psychological intelligence during routine medical consultations, documenting not just physical ailments but emotional states, family tensions, and individual psychological vulnerabilities. Medical records became repositories of intimate intelligence that served imperial control objectives rather than purely therapeutic purposes, transforming the healing arts into tools of social manipulation and political control. Women throughout the empire faced particular scrutiny under these domestic surveillance programs. Claudius had developed complex theories about female psychology and social behavior that required extensive observational data for validation and refinement. Female agents, carefully selected and trained for their ability to gain the confidence of other women, were embedded within social networks to document conversations, relationships, and behavioral patterns that revealed insights into female psychology and social dynamics. The intelligence gathered about women's private lives served multiple imperial objectives beyond pure research. The emperor used intimate knowledge of individual women's psychological vulnerabilities, emotional attachments, and social relationships to manipulate their husband's political behavior and ensure loyalty to imperial authority. Women became unwitting tools of imperial control, their private lives serving as leverage for managing male citizens who might otherwise pose challenges to imperial rule. Childbearing and child-rearing practices became subjects of intensive investigation as Claudius sought to understand how family environments shaped individual psychological development and social behavior. Agents documented parenting techniques, disciplinary methods, educational approaches, and emotional dynamics within families, gathering data that informed imperial policies about population management and social engineering. The emperor believed that controlling childhood development would allow imperial authority to shape future generations, according to specifications that served long-term imperial objectives. The cumulative psychological effects of living under such intensive domestic surveillance created a society where authentic human relationship became increasingly rare and dangerous. Citizens learned to maintain emotional distance even within their own families, understanding that genuine intimacy created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by imperial authority. Marriage became a performance, parenthood a form of political compliance, and childhood a preparation for lives lived under constant observation and potential manipulation. The documentation requirements for domestic surveillance agents were extraordinarily detailed and comprehensive. Reports included not just factual observations about behavior and conversation, but psychological analysis of emotional states, relationship dynamics, and individual character development. Agents were trained to interpret subtle behavioral cues, emotional expressions, and social interactions according to theoretical frameworks that Claudius had developed through his broader research program, creating a systematic methodology for reducing human intimacy to observable data points. The transmission and analysis of this domestic intelligence required sophisticated administrative systems that could handle vast quantities of sensitive information while maintaining security and confidentiality. Imperial bureaucrats developed specialized skills in psychological analysis, data compilation, and predictive modeling that allowed them to transform raw observational data into actionable intelligence for population control and political manipulation. The domestic surveillance network became a prototype for systematic social control that influenced imperial administration for centuries after Claudius's death. Local administrators throughout the empire received training in utilizing domestic intelligence for governance objectives. They learned to identify and exploit family tensions, marital conflicts, and individual psychological vulnerabilities to maintain social stability and ensure compliance with imperial authority. Domestic surveillance data became a tool for preventive social control, allowing administrators to identify and address potential sources of unrest before they developed into serious challenges to imperial rule. The integration of domestic surveillance with other components of Claudius's research program created synergistic effects that amplified the emperor's ability to understand and control human behavior. Information gathered from family environments informed military experiments, educational programs, and economic policies, while data from these broader investigations provided context for interpreting domestic observations. The result was a comprehensive understanding of human psychology and social dynamics that enabled unprecedented levels of social control and behavioral manipulation. Religious institutions found themselves serving as both targets and tools of domestic surveillance, as agents documented how families balanced private religious conviction with public compliance to imperial religious requirements. The emperor was particularly interested in understanding the psychological mechanisms that allowed individuals to maintain personal faith while participating in state ceremonies that contradicted their private beliefs, gathering intelligence that informed broader strategies for religious control and spiritual manipulation. The long-term effects of domestic surveillance extended far beyond the immediate families under investigation. Knowledge that such programs existed created a climate of suspicion and self-censorship that affected even households that were never directly targeted. Citizens modified their behavior based on the assumption that they might be under observation, creating social environments where authentic human expression became increasingly rare and dangerous. As the years passed and the domestic surveillance network expanded throughout the empire, Roman society underwent fundamental changes that reflected the psychological impact of living under constant potential observation. Trust became a luxury that few could afford, intimacy a risk that many chose to avoid, and authentic human connection a dangerous vulnerability that could be exploited by imperial authority. The emperor's investigation into human nature was transforming that nature itself, creating populations that were psychologically adapted to life under systematic surveillance and control. The marble corridors of the imperial palace that had witnessed Caligula's theatrical madness now hummed with the quiet efficiency of data analysis and psychological research. Teams of scholars worked day and night, compiling intelligence from domestic surveillance networks, analyzing patterns of human behavior, and developing theoretical frameworks that could explain and predict social dynamics with scientific precision. The emperor's vision of systematic understanding and control of human nature was becoming reality, transforming Roman civilization into something unprecedented in human history. Yet even as Claudius's domestic surveillance network achieved unprecedented success in penetrating the private lives of Roman citizens, the emperor recognized that his investigations had only begun to scratch the surface of human psychological complexity. The data gathered from families throughout the empire revealed patterns and behaviors that challenged his theoretical frameworks and suggested depths of human nature that remained unexplored. The success of domestic surveillance created demands for even more intensive and systematic investigation, pushing the emperor toward experiments that would test the absolute limits of human endurance and psychological resilience. The emperor's appetite for understanding human limits led him to establish what he privately called his threshold laboratories, specialized facilities hidden beneath public buildings throughout Rome, where the boundaries between research and torture became indistinguishable. These weren't the crude dungeons of previous rulers, but sophisticated research environments equipped with instruments designed to measure precisely how much physical and psychological pressure human beings could withstand before fundamental aspects of their personality began to break down and reform. Claudius had become obsessed with what he termed the reconstruction of consciousness, the possibility that human identity itself could be systematically dismantled and rebuilt according to imperial specifications. His researchers worked with subjects selected for their psychological resilience, individuals who had demonstrated exceptional mental strength in their previous lives as soldiers, scholars, or administrators. The emperor believed that if his techniques could break and reshape such individuals, they would prove equally effective on weaker personalities throughout the general population. The methodologies employed in these threshold laboratories reflected Claudius's systematic approach to human investigation. Subjects were first subjected to comprehensive psychological evaluation, designed to map their mental defenses, emotional attachments, and core beliefs. This initial assessment could take weeks, with researchers documenting every aspect of the subject's personality, memory, and psychological structure before beginning the process of systematic deconstruction. The actual reconstruction process involved carefully calibrated combinations of sensory deprivation, sleep disruption, nutritional manipulation, and psychological pressure designed to create states of consciousness that made subjects susceptible to fundamental personality modification. These weren't random torture sessions, but precisely controlled environments where every variable was monitored and adjusted to produce specific psychological effects. The emperor's personal involvement in designing these procedures reflected his genuine belief that he was advancing human knowledge and developing tools that would benefit imperial administration for generations to come. Teams of specialized personnel operated these facilities under conditions of absolute secrecy. The researchers themselves underwent psychological conditioning, designed to maintain their clinical objectivity while observing human suffering that would normally trigger empathetic responses. They learned to view their subjects as experimental materials rather than human beings, a mental framework that allowed them to document personality breakdown and reconstruction with the same detachment that other scholars brought to studying plant growth or mineral formation. The documentation from these threshold laboratories reveals the extraordinary sophistication of Claudius's research methodology. Researchers maintained detailed records not just of their procedures and their subjects' responses, but of the theoretical frameworks that guided their investigations. They developed elaborate models of human psychology that attempted to explain consciousness, memory, and personality formation in terms that allowed for systematic manipulation and control. These theoretical advances represented genuine contributions to understanding human nature, even as they were applied for purposes that violated every principle of human dignity and individual autonomy. What made these experiments particularly disturbing was their apparent success in achieving the Emperor's objectives. Subjects who entered the threshold laboratories as psychologically intact individuals emerged as fundamentally different people, their original personalities replaced by constructed identities that served imperial purposes. These reconstructed individuals functioned normally in social situations, displaying appropriate emotional responses and maintaining complex relationships, but their deepest loyalties and motivations had been systematically altered to align with imperial objectives. The emperor used these reconstructed individuals as agents throughout the empire, placing them in positions where their artificial personalities would serve imperial intelligence and control objectives. Former military commanders became advocates for policies they had previously opposed, their apparent conversion to imperial ideology seeming genuine because it reflected actual changes in their psychological structure rather than mere political calculation. Scholars and administrators who had shown independent thinking emerged from the laboratories as enthusiastic supporters of imperial research programs, their intellectual capabilities intact, but redirected toward objectives they would never have chosen in their original psychological states. The success of personality reconstruction created opportunities for social engineering that extended far beyond individual manipulation. Claudius began to envision entire populations whose psychological development could be shaped from childhood to produce adults whose personalities were optimally suited for imperial service. The threshold laboratories served as prototypes for educational and social systems that could implement personality modification on a massive scale, creating generations of citizens whose individual autonomy had been systematically eliminated in favor of collective loyalty to imperial authority. Religious leaders throughout the empire became particular targets for threshold experimentation, as Claudius recognized their potential influence over popular opinion and social behavior. Priests and spiritual teachers who underwent personality reconstruction emerged as powerful advocates for imperial religious policies, their apparent spiritual authority lending credibility to state-sponsored ceremonies and beliefs. These reconstructed religious leaders could promote imperial ideology with genuine conviction because their personalities had been systematically modified to align their spiritual beliefs with political objectives. The philosophical implications of successful personality reconstruction challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and individual identity that had guided Roman civilization for centuries. If consciousness could be systematically dismantled and rebuilt, what meaning did concepts like personal responsibility, moral choice, or individual dignity retain? The emperor's researchers grappled with these questions not from ethical concern, but from genuine intellectual curiosity about the nature of human existence and the possibilities for social organization that their discoveries created. The marble corridors that once echoed with Caligula's mad ravings now whispered with something far more terrifying. The quiet scratch of styluses recording human screams, the measured footsteps of researchers documenting the systematic destruction of human souls, the clinical discussions about consciousness itself as raw material for imperial engineering. Claudius had achieved what his theatrical predecessor never could have imagined: the transformation of cruelty into science, of human suffering into scholarly pursuit, of absolute power into a tool for remaking human nature itself. In those threshold laboratories beneath Rome's streets, the emperor had discovered that the human spirit could be broken down and rebuilt like any other mechanism. Consciousness dismantled and reassembled according to imperial specifications. This wasn't just tyranny. It was the birth of systematic dehumanization disguised as intellectual achievement. And perhaps the most chilling realization is that the techniques pioneered in those hidden chambers didn't die with their creator. They evolved, adapted, and found new forms throughout history. proving that the greatest monsters are indeed those who convince us they're scholars, and that the most dangerous experiments are the ones conducted in the name of understanding human nature itself.